Very pleased to make a few remarks on the Statutes Amendment Education, Training and Skills Portfolio Bill. I commend the Minister for bringing the bill to the House and indicate that the opposition will be supporting it, but I'll place on the record some reflections on the nature of legislation in education space and on each of the four measures in this bill. For the first 18 months, I suspect it was, maybe even 2 years that the Marshall Liberal government was in office, we sought to undertake reform of the Education Act and the Children's Services Act, acts that have been in place since the early 1970s, which were completely rewritten by the Education and Children's Services Bill. It was an evolution of bills that had been prepared first under, I think, in the late period of the Brown, Olsen, Kerrin government under Malcolm Buckby. Work started on things that needed to be updated in that education bill, and then through subsequent years, the Labor Party initially, when they first took government in 2002, focused only on the age of compulsory education, and ultimately there was some work done, particularly under the auspices of the now Deputy Premier, in a rewrite of the bill. There were some significant sticking points to enable this work to be done, and indeed that bill was never given the priority necessary to get it through the Parliament, let alone resolving those sticking points. But I acknowledge that certainly a great deal of the bodywork in that bill was started in that 2016-2017 period. In 2018, we were elected with a mandate to implement those reforms, but with some variations. We put in place a new approach to dealing with attendance and truancy, an approach that I note that the Minister is now seeking to work with, and which I would have certainly looked forward to seeking to work with had COVID not been a significant barrier to any reasonable approach to dealing with truancy throughout the 2020 and 2021 school years, which I hesitate to say that for obvious reasons, because indeed I've noted some commentary that suggests they weren't for obvious reasons, but I'll say it for obvious reasons. During that period of the pandemic, it was very difficult to determine a student not being absent at school as truant when we were urging parents, were there any sign of illness, a sign of a sniffly nose, so any sign that somebody might have a flu-like symptom, a potential COVID case, we were urging parents to keep those children home. Very difficult in those circumstances to rack somebody up as being a truant in those circumstances. But it was in that legislation that we established the Education Family Conferencing, which I note the member for King talked about as an important reform, and which is now available as a tool, as a mechanism to help the Education Department engage effectively with families and ensure those kids get back at school, because every day lost at school in a child's learning is a lost opportunity to engage with the curriculum, to help find a pathway towards a successful future in which that student may thrive and fulfil their potential. We need kids to be at school. It is, in fact, one of the most important things that any family can do is ensure their child is getting to school. And the Education Family Conferencing notifies the significant role that families play in getting that child to school. We don't want to impose huge truancy fines on a family that is doing their best. And indeed, sir, a court would never impose such a fine. The importance of the court's involvement in a prosecution is something that was lost from the original Labor bill in 2016 and 17 when they were endeavouring to introduce an expiation notice on a child not being at school. We thought that that was a missed opportunity. We thought that actually the engagement was very important to getting that child back to school. And while it meant that there was a risk of a greater fine, being $5,000 if the student the family was not attempting to get their child to school, that it would require a court's engagement in the process, so circumstances could be taken into consideration. But to enable both the best forward-leaning opportunity to get that child back to school, and also to provide an easy measure of whether a family was interested in helping their child get to school, the Education Family Conferencing model was developed and indeed piloted and trialled during the term of the former government. And I'm sure it's going to be a boon to the now Minister as he seeks to do this. Because, of course, in an education family conference, the circumstance, we can bring in the principal, you can bring in authorised officers, whether they be truancy officers, potentially police if needed, behaviour and wellbeing related staff, and indeed the family, and find an understanding with the student of what is the block to their attendance at school. And should that family not engage in an education family conference, then that's a sign that potentially the stick of the prosecution may be necessary. And I tell you what, having those larger fines certainly captures the attention of anybody who's not interested in engaging positively and proactively with the process in the first point. All of this work was part of indeed the 120 or 130 clauses of the Education Children's Services Bill 2019, which put in place these measures. We also, during this period, increased by 50% the resource available for truancy officers or social workers engaging in attendance. There's a number of different classifications, which indeed within the department they use, but effectively truancy officers were increased from 20 to 30 during the period from 2018 to 2022, in line with our election commitments, because we felt that there were too many schools, too many students required to be supported by each one of these people with an important role and powers to help get those kids back to school. Again, COVID did prevent in 2020 and 2021 the full benefits of this work to be realised, and now the new minister has the new-ish minister about to celebrate 1 year in the role tomorrow, I guess, has the opportunity to do this work, and we trust and we expect and we will accept nothing less than continued improvement in relation to this matter. Now, the clause that's relevant in this bill is one that deals with an ambiguity, certainly an unintentional ambiguity, and one where it is not clear that there is a problem, but certainly if there's a suggestion of ambiguity and we are dealing with other matters as well, then we fix it. So when a student is engaged in a VET program as part of their school studies, that program may involve a student doing some of their hours outside of the school in a registered training organisation or through a service, or indeed, of course, it could be a school-based apprenticeship. And as that relates to truancy, this bill makes it clear that there is no difference from the truancy point of view and accountability for school attendance, whether that student is at the RTO or indeed inside the school grounds. They must be present performing that sort of activity. Now, as I say, I'm not convinced that that wasn't the case under the previous law, but rather than give any opportunity in one of the truancy-related prosecutions that may well potentially come up in the future should a child should a child's family be prosecuted in this way, I think it's fair enough to make it clear beyond any doubt. The second clause that's relevant in the bill is in relation to international students. Now, about a decade ago, the former Labor government, under I think it would have been Jennifer Rankin at the time, the minister might remember, he was the chief of staff in her office. I think it was Jennifer Rankin, made a budget decision. Potentially the now Treasurer, who would have been the economics advisor to Premier Weatherill, might have been the one that made the decision. It might not have been the Minister for Education. It might have been the Treasurer that made this decision under the former government, that a budget savings measure would be put in place where the former government said international students could no longer get free education in our public schools. Indeed, instead they would be charged significant fees, significant to the point, I should say so, that one of the significant effects of it was that many students in this situation left our public school system and went to low-fee independent schools or Catholic schools because the fees at those non-government schools were lower than the public school fees that these international students were required to charge. Circumstances are different from school to school, of course, and indeed there was a a range of different reasons international students are in our schools. Some, of course, were always intended to be fee-paying students who, particularly in senior secondary years, are invited to come and study, to pay the fees, and indeed have that 1 year or 2 year experience in our schools. That's not what this deals with. This deals with students who are in a situation where potentially their parents have come from overseas for whatever circumstances, and indeed they're not citizens, they haven't got permanent residency, and they are in our school system, being charged thousands of dollars. Now, in that environment, the savings mechanism was created when the budget measure was allowed, that a school principal could apply a discount or an exemption. In practice, I think from the very start, I stand to be corrected, but certainly during when I arrived as Education Minister in 2018, it was already the common practice that principal delegated that authority to the Chief Executive. Effectively, it was Chris Bernardi, it was the Chief Finance Officer, now Chief Operating Officer of the department, who would have the authority to do this. My understanding is between 2012 or 2013, when the budget measure came into place, and 2018, it was one that had rarely been used. But there are circumstances that arise, as I'm sure all members can imagine, whereby very sympathetic cases present themselves, especially where there are multiple children, where somebody's circumstances change abruptly, and indeed the power was exercised a number of times when I was the Minister to either significantly reduce or in certain cases, I believe, exempt some families from paying that fine. We also took a view when we were in government that while there were a great number of metropolitan schools that were very much at capacity, and it wouldn't be possible to completely reinstate free public education for many people in these visa categories, we did take the view that there was absolutely nothing to be lost by allowing schools, particularly in regional areas, in the Adelaide Hills, many of them small schools, to have more students, international students, many of course people in communities where agriculture and horticulture rely on workforces from overseas. We thought it would actually be an excellent idea for those families to be incentivised to come and work in South Australia by allowing their children to attend schools. Many of those schools, particularly at the smaller end, would benefit greatly from having those extra students, and there was no risk of capacity being a problem. So we did change that fairly significantly when we were in government to free up the opportunity for many of these families to send their kids to public schools. And I haven't got any data on it, but I'd be very surprised if that didn't see a significant uptake. This clause is an administrative change. It moves that power from the principal, which has been delegated for years, to the Chief Executive or the Chief Finance Officer. It changes the legislation, so it removes the question. It takes away that principal's authority and gives it to the Chief Executive. Now, in effect, this is an authority that has never been used by a principal, and you wouldn't necessarily think it was appropriate for that principal to have that power. It puts the principal in an invidious position. If somebody comes to the principal with one of these questions of very awkward situation where somebody's asking for their school fee burden to be relieved because of the awful personal circumstances they're in, the principal then has to make a judgment. That's not fair on that principal, sir. And that's why I suspect in practice it's always been delegated, and that's why I support and the opposition will support moving it in practice in this legislation. The third part of the bill is in relation to the Education Standards Board, or to give it its full title, and I challenged the Minister in his second reading response to say this full title without reference to his notes. I'm not going to try. The Education and Early this is with looking at the notes to be clear, the Education and Early Childhood Services Registration and Standards Board. A catchy title. Again, I think Jennifer Rankin may have been the Minister that passed that act, and the Minister was therefore the Chief of Staff and is responsible for this. The board itself is referred to as the Education Standards Board these days because everybody prefers to call it the ESB than that other name. Now, when I became the Minister, the chair of the Education Standards Board was John Dawkins, the former Labor federal treasurer, and the registrar was Chris Chatburn. Chris Chatburn had in effect been the registrar since the board was formed. The board brought together 3 different registration authorities and combined them into one. It was a useful reform, it was an important reform, and it's a reform that I think has been gratefully received by many. It was particularly important in the period after the National Quality Framework for Early Childhood Standards was brought into place. This was, again, just about a decade ago. It was a federal reform supported by the Education Ministerial Council, as it was then. And that reform was particularly important in relation to early childhood services, but also relevant to preschools and relevant to out-of-school hours care facilities. Provided national consistency in the manner in which OSH and long daycare services, occasional care services, family daycare services and preschools were given authority to continue their work. 7 categories ranging from the infrastructure of the service to a series of requirements effectively that services needed to match up to. And we needed the registrations of those around Australia to be relatively consistent. The board is also responsible for the registration of schools, including new schools, and there were a number of new schools given authority to come into existence while I was the Minister, which was very encouraging, and indeed ongoing monitoring, assessment and rating of them. When John Dawkins stepped aside from the chairmanship of the board, Anne Dulett, who had been the deputy, stepped into that role, and we were pleased to reappoint her. We thought she did a good job. And I note that earlier this year, the Minister and Cabinet has endorsed Alana Girvan to take on that role. Alana Girvan was an exceptional educator, but the reason I have great confidence and commend the Minister on that appointment was through the experience I had with her, not only during the period when she was in charge of effectively monitoring internal disciplinary situations within the Department for Education, which is a very, very important role indeed, but also because her last role while working for the Education Department was very focused on being the liaison with the COVID management team within SA Health. And of course, throughout 2020 and 2021, and indeed even more so at the beginning of 2022, but the interface between SA Health and the Education Department couldn't have been more important. The fact that South Australian school students had less disruption to their education, they had disruption to be sure, but so did every student in the world. And by comparison with every other jurisdiction in Australia, Western Australia was the only jurisdiction that came close to the level of low levels of disruption that South Australia had. And compared to jurisdictions elsewhere in the world, it was chalk and cheese. Ensuring that early childhood services, schools, non-government and government alike in the Catholic system were singing from the same song sheet, were giving the same information to their families, their parents, their staff, their students, was critically important. Alana Girvan played a really key role through that, both in ensuring that the messages from SA Health had a conduit to education, that the Education Department trusted, that indeed the non-government sector in education trusted. But also somebody with significant experience in education was embedded in the SA Health Office, so that there would be, at the points where decisions were being made early on and recommendations were being produced in short time, as evidence came to light in the most difficult of circumstances, Alana played a key role in ensuring that there was an educational insight in that office able to provide feedback. And she did a great job. Did we get everything perfect? No, of course not. Nobody in the world did. But I think that it's beyond question that South Australia did a damn good job, sir, in ensuring that our students were always at the centre, their health and safety and well-being was supported, as was their right to an education, which also plays an important role in their health and safety and well-being. And so I commend Alana for that work, and I commend the Minister for recognising her expertise and, with the support of Cabinet, elevating her to the role of the presiding member. Chris Chatburn, I mentioned before, did a great job as the registrar of the ESB for a long time, and decided, against my strong recommendation, against my advice, against my requests, just that she thought that it was important that at some point in her life she be allowed to retire. And cruelly, for me as the Minister, she proceeded with that plan towards the end of our time in office. And I commend Chris for her tremendous work, for the tremendous career that she had in that role, the broad respect that she had within the education system and the education sector, and indeed thank her on the record on this occasion for the support she gave me as Minister, particularly in relation to some complex matters. Kerry Lever was the choice to replace her, and I know that we all wish Kerry well in that work going forward. The Education Standards Board's role in assessing compliance, supporting and indeed ensuring that new services are fit for purpose, and indeed ongoing monitoring, assessment and rating of schools and early childhood services is critically important. We invested an extra $1 million of state taxpayers' money in our first budget, indeed within the education budget, to ensure that it could continue that work at the level that was expected, because we wanted to ensure that our children, and particularly through early childhood services, were not slipping through the cracks due to a lack of ability to assess and monitor their compliance with safety issues. It's no small thing, whether it's a private service or a not-for-profit service, for the Education Standards Board to come in and put some sort of block on the service being able to be offered. And indeed, there is a difficult task when somebody is in breach of their conditions to undertake that task of whether this is an accidental one-off circumstance that could not have been foreseen, that was no one's fault and that needs to be, the service needs to be supported, or whether it's a more significant systemic issue that requires that service to cease. And the Education Standards Board works very hard to get those calls right. It indeed has, during our term, expanded its role to also include more work in the student exchange programs as well, which are very important. The ESB, I mentioned Alana Gervin's work during COVID, but the ESB had a particular role during the COVID pandemic. Again, they had a liaison and embedded in SA Health at one stage, at a couple of points, indeed, when the case numbers were high, and they provided important advice, and I recognise that work. They also provided an important conduit with those, and there's more than 1,000 of these early childhood registered services in South Australia. And because the arrangements for them, some of them are run by government as part of schools or government preschools, OSH services indeed. There are a number that are attached to non-government school services. There are standalone preschools, there are standalone kindergartens, there are government preschools there, and the government ones were fine. But engaging in that manner that we did with the schools, with early childhood services, which many of which would have their own private ownership situations, many run by councils, indeed dozens run by councils, hundreds run by bigger organisations, and indeed there are also about 100 community-based organisations, each with their own boards and committees running those organisations. So to get all of them on the same page, understanding the COVID restrictions, the best advice coming out of SA Health, was a significant challenge. And the Education Standards Board was really the only conduit that government, through the Health Department and the Education Department, could use, short of going through the media. But the Education Standards Board ensured that all of our early childhood services had the accurate information, and that too contributed to our state's strong response during 2020 and 2021 to the COVID pandemic. Gave reassurance to many families who were in a situation that they were able to keep taking their children to childcare, certainly early on when little was known about the disease, and then when it became clear that that first iteration of COVID was not having the same effect on children and was not being transmitted by children in the same way that later variants did. That was a very significant job. and I thank the ESB for the role they played in supporting the government during that period. They also played a role in early 2022 when the situation was changing significantly, when our Chief Public Health Officer determined that rapid antigen tests were to be part of the mix, and again that early childhood services were able to benefit from the work of the ESB in assisting with ensuring that there was some access to those rats, and that was important too. The work of the Education Standards Board is supported by an excellent board full of people who have varying experiences within the school and early childhood sector, and I commend them for that work. They have deputies, and this bill's significant change, well, maybe not that significant, but no doubt it'll make life easier for the Education Standards Board and the Cabinet Office, is that if those members of the board step down or are removed for some reason, the deputies can act up without having to go through the whole Cabinet process again. We have no particular problem with this move, so happy to facilitate it. The final part of the legislation relates to the History Trust. History Trust is a fantastic South Australian institution which celebrated its 40th anniversary in, I think, 2021 and maybe 2022. I think it was 2021. The History Trust came about under the Tonkin government, and from conception to legislation passing, it was less than 6 months, sir. A task I offer to those opposite to conceive of a new institution that will stand the test of time and only be seen in future decades to be more and more appreciated, from conception of the idea to legislation through the Parliament in less than 6 months was a significant feat. I commend the late the Honourable Murray Hill for his particular role there, as well as the late the Honourable Dr. David Tonkin. The History Trust is responsible not just for, although it's no small thing, to manage those History Trust museums, the Maritime Museum, the National Motor Museum at Birdwood, and the Migration Museum, as well as the more recent addendum, the Centre for Democracy. It's also responsible for the state's history collection, which is a vast treasure trove of items, artefacts, memorabilia, and things that, with significant value to our state, both real and inherent, but that are able to be part of telling the story of what South Australia is, who we are in the world and where we have come from, both truth-telling and also celebration. And I think that the way that the state's history collection is used by the museums is positive and strong, but there are tremendous opportunities in the years ahead, and I hope they'll be taken up by the new government to expand on the way that we tell stories of South Australia's past, being proud of the very many different stories of how our current South Australian community is made up of people who've come here for different reasons and arrived at different times, but together we, understanding that past, are able to work together to make our state stronger. History Trust is important. We tell those stories particularly during May, the month of the History Festival. It started off as a History Week, and indeed a couple of decades later we now have a month-long History Festival, which is one of the most significant community participation events in our state. Not only are there significant events put on by glorious institutions, the museum, the library, indeed the Parliamentary Library, and Dr. John Westy and his team put on an event every History Festival. But right across South Australia, from Farina to Port Macdonald, from Ceduna to Port Adelaide, there are indeed community organisations, councils, national trust groups, and so many other organisations telling the stories of South Australia in their own ways, whether it's through open days at buildings or history talks by luminaries such as Keith Conlon on different aspects of South Australia's history and life. That's a great opportunity for people to participate, but what I love about it is the way that people who have insight into our communities take those opportunities to tell those stories, whether it's to 10 people in a room or 1,000 people in the town hall. all equally important to that festival, equally valued by that festival, and I commend Greg Mackey and Elizabeth Ho, and indeed all of the trustees of the History Trust for the great work that they do. The History Trust has certain modest powers in relation to maintaining good order or protecting property under the care or control of the Trust on their premises. Those exist in the currently legislation. That could be used to deal with offensive behaviour relating to a particular group's display at the Migration Museum. It could be relating to protection of important artefacts. Somebody could be banned from a site for a day or for longer under the Act as it stands at the moment in order to protect good order. In a way, it hasn't been used, it hasn't been required to be used, but I can certainly envisage circumstances in which it might need to be used, and it's an appropriate set of powers. The clause in this bill extends those powers to sites being used by the History Trust temporarily to conduct activities or events related to its functions. Where the Migration Museum might want to rent a room to do a display, for example, perhaps while it was undergoing some of the significant renovations, including those funded dramatically by the former Liberal government, and I thank Rob Lucas for that investment. It could be to do with the Beta Birdwood renting some space in an adjacent property. These are the sorts of circumstances where the History Trust might use some other spaces, and this extends the powers they currently have to those opportunities. If they're to exist, these powers, for their current purpose, then this seems to be a logical extension, and so it has our support. These are the 4 measures that are in the bill, clarifying that VET programs are equally captured by the intent of the bill for truancy accountability as school attendance, ensuring that the current practice relating to principals delegating their authority to waive or amend international student fees to the Chief Executive is set into legislation. Enabling deputy members of the Education Standards Board to serve as full members without having to go back to Cabinet, and then indeed the History Trust being able to rent spaces and continue to have their powers. I think I've summed up everything that could possibly be said about these 4 powers. I look forward to hearing if there are any government speakers who have something new to add to that. The opposition will support the bill.